So today we're going to look at Nyarlathotep, which is a hard enough title to pronounce, by H.P. Lovecraft, and this is the 9th story in the order in which I am reading them. And we have gone from a, we'll say, relatively fun story about fishy creatures having their revenge to a story about cats having their revenge, and then straight into a dark, lurking, brooding, unhappy situation, which is more of what we tend to think of when we think of Lovecraft. So I enjoyed this story very much. I like the whole feel of it, and I think Lovecraft does this extremely well. The way that he creates this atmosphere of danger and evil and things that just couldn't possibly be understood. So it starts with, I have to get this name right again, Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, I am the last, I will tell the audience void. So this person who's speaking is the last remaining person who can speak of what has happened and what they have seen, and there is no one left at all to even tell it to. He's just talking out into a void of emptiness, but he wants to share his story. So from this point where he's the last person, he says it all started happening a couple months ago. There was horrible tension. It was a season of political and social upheaval, a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger, widespread and all-embracing, and people went about with pale and worried faces. So in essence, it's modern times. So he's feeling the kinds of things. And you know, this was also, he lived during World War I, all sorts of very, very nasty things happening back then. And he wanted to go to fight, but his mom wouldn't let him go and fight, even though he was an adult. So he had all of that kind of guilt involved in there as well. So all of the sense of political danger, the social upheaval, the physical things happening, people with pale and worried faces, and a sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land. And then also, intriguingly, he says there was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely. I'm trying to get the cat not to eat beads, which is not good for him. Come on, shoo. So the autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world and perhaps the universe had passed from the control of known gods or forces and that to that of gods or forces which were unknown. So I mean, we're having that happen now with the climate crisis, this sense that the world is getting out of control and it won't be able to be regained in a way that keeps humans alive. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell. Well, we know what his name is. Maybe they're saying that we don't know if he's a god or a man or a what. He was old native blood and looked like a pharaoh, which is sort of implying that they think he's a human. But then they say he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries. So he's from the time, you know, of the pyramids, and people sort of know him but don't know him. So I guess in that sense we could say that they must know he's supernatural, but that he's human-like, and that he heard messages from places not on this planet. So he's in connection with space aliens and other sentient beings. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep. So they don't put places like Egypt as being civilization. Those are just, you know, rural places of chaos. And he came over to, let's assume that he means Boston, because this the author Lovecraft is from Providence, Boston, New York City. All right, well, let's say New York City. Seems more likely of what he's referring to about the lands of civilization. And you would think that this Nyarlathotep would be someone who likes the old ways, likes divination and, I don't know, prophecies and things like that. But instead they're talking about him. He's always buying strange instruments of glass and metal and combining them into instruments yet stranger. So he's actually more of a scientist and a researcher. And maybe because he has a strange space alien information that he is using to build these kinds of things. He spoke much of the sciences of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power, which was a thing that was going on during this time period. There would be scientists going around trying to help people understand how electricity worked and other things to try to get the society to accept those things more quickly. So people would go to these exhibitions of power. His spectators were speechless. He has swelled his fame. So he's going around from town to town, city to city, talking about his machinery that he's building and how electricity works. So people went to see him. They told their friends to see him. And there were screams of nightmare because people are getting so overwhelmed by what they're seeing at these exhibitions and the general sense of upheaval and danger that is happening in society as a whole. So there's shrieks of cities, and there's a pale, pitying moon crumbling against the sickly sky, and green waters gliding under bridges. So now we don't have a gibbous moon. We have a pale, pitying moon. His moon is changing its shape as we get into these more dark areas. So finally this Nyarlathotep comes to his city, the great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. So we're going back with New York City again. So his friend says that they should go see him, and they decide they're going to see him. It's a hot autumn night with restless crowds. There's screens, and there's worlds battling against blackness on the screens, and sparks playing amazingly, and he thinks that it's static electricity. And then Nyarlathotep is upset at them dismissing the things that he's showing them, and he drives them all out down the dizzy stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. And the main character screams loud that he's not afraid, that he could never be afraid. And they all said that the city is the same and still alive. And when the electric lights began to fade, they laughed at their fear. And it says, I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon. Maybe this calls back to the previous story about green, slimy moon creatures. My cat is just, I think my cat has gotten agitated by all the talk of dark monsters. Here, just curl up and wait. Yes, yes. Good kitty. There we go. All right, we got the cat under control. Greenish moon. They're looking around, and this part reminds me very much of Stranger Things in the Upside Down, the sense that there is a parallel world which is like your current world, but which is decaying and falling apart and on a course of disrepair. So once they come out of the seminar that was given about the static electricity and stuff, they look around and they see that the pavement has blocks that are loose and displaced by grass, that there's a line of rusted metal that showed where the tramways once ran, and there's a tram car, lone, wilderness, dilapidated, and almost on its side. So it's as if they have come out and their world has suddenly turned into a far future world where everything is decayed and falling apart. There's weed-choked subway entrances. There's open country, a chill which was not of the hot autumn, and there's dark moors. There's trackless, inexplicable snows, swept asunder in one direction. And there's green litten snow, so he just doesn't like fishy things in the color green. And he hears disquieting wails, and his companions start to vanish. And it seems like he is the only one that is left behind as all of his companions are vanishing in this falling apart version of the world that they have. And then we get into the final paragraph, which really has Lovecraft come together. Like I said in the past, I like his descriptions. They are very unusual and different from a lot of the other books that are out there, which makes them enjoyable to read. And he also does a good job of creating this sense of unease and things are just wrong and being unsettled. So screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirled blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation, corpses of dead worlds with sores that were cities, charnel winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. So this whole sense that everything has died, everything is rotting, there are no people anymore, he is left alone, and he doesn't know even where he is because it's not even the land that he was in before. And through this revolting graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beats of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time. So I like this much better than the story a couple stories ago, which had him in a world which he said was just black mud and silence. To me, black mud and silence is not very troubling. Mud is nice and soft and squishy, it doesn't have thorns in it, and silence is pretty peaceful. So now we've moved over to something that I do find less settling. So he's got the world that he knew, but it's all collapsed and fallen apart, and there's broken glass and fallen apart things everywhere. And it's not nice and quiet. There is monotonous whining of flutes, which can be pretty shrill and nasty if they're just going on, and then the maddening beating of drums, which will not stop and just keep thumping and thumping and thumping. And at this point, you're really hoping for silence, and hoping for everything just to be quiet for a while. And then he says that he knows that the only thing that's left is the Nyarlathotep. And also I like that he says, the detestable pounding and piping whereunto dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly. He just has this obsession with things dancing not in a way that he approves of. You know, in the previous story, he was kept picking on the poor little fishy creatures or I suppose 2 stories ago, picking on the fishy creatures for not dancing in a nice way and harassing them for their dancing style. And now here we're saying that we've got people dancing slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly. And the things that are dancing are the gigantic ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep. And he also has a thing about them being voiceless. Now, I don't think it's a bad thing to be voiceless. It seems quite fine to be voiceless. I mean, you could use sign language, or you can use telepathy. There's so many other ways to communicate. Or you can just write. You can just write letters to each other. So for some reason, being voiceless is very troubling to him. I can see being voiceless being troubling in the sense that you have something you want to say and you can't find a way to communicate it. But in the sense that there's like other people out there who just choose not to talk, I don't see that as being that troubling. And it says that they're blind. I mean, okay, so they don't see with their eyes. They probably see with telepathy or something else. You know, they could be like bats. So those kinds of things I don't find as naturally horror-filled. But some of the other things that he's talking about, the world collapsing into decay, the drumming that won't stop, the flute playing that won't stop, those kinds of things I do get. Now, it's interesting. He doesn't have much of a sense of smell here, which he did very well in some of his other stories, but it seems like I didn't see anything in there that had to do with smells, and usually he's good at involving all the different senses involved. And there really isn't a sense of touch in there, like the other one had the sticky, gooey mud in it, and this one just has the city which is fallen apart. It'd be nice if there was like his fingers felt the dust of the decaying bodies or something like that. But it goes pretty much into there being nobody at all except for him and except for this sense of the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles being around him. So I do like this sense of decay. It does, you know, and this was written quite a long time ago, and it still is fairly appropriate for current times with the sense of political and social upheaval, people being pale and hurried and worried, and the sense that the seasons are completely out of whack, and it's probably even far more true now than it was back then for Lovecraft. Other than that, I mean, nothing really happens in this story, but he does a very good sense of this growing and impending doom, and that, you know, it seems really odd that everyone just accepts this Egyptian person from 27 centuries ago and goes out and talks to him without, you know, wondering where he came from or what his purpose is to interact with people. There isn't very much made about that whole mystic aspect of him. I think it might have liked it better if it didn't talk about the 27 centuries and just talked about him coming up out of a dark, unknown country and then suddenly having all this knowledge that people would think that he shouldn't have and that sort of thing. But, you know, for whatever reason, he felt it had to be about 27 centuries ago. So other than that, I enjoyed the story's feel and the write-up of it, the descriptions of the words that he used, and that it's much more a sense of horror for me than some of the previous stories were. So let me know what you think.